We are on the book of Jonah, right? So in large part, everything has been pointing to Jonah, right? Because we all know Jonah. And we might think that this call to Nineveh just kind of came out of the blue, right? But you can tell at this point in our study of discipleship and mission in the Old Testament, that Jonah is just kind of building upon all of these previous books and missionaries and people of God. So here's the book of Jonah in 2 sentences. All right, so here it is. The book of Jonah doesn't begin where it begins, and it doesn't end where it ends. All right, so I'll say that again. The book of Jonah doesn't begin where it begins, and it doesn't end where it ends. And you're saying, what's all that about? Well, let's unpack it, all right? Here we go. Well, of course, we could just leave it at that and call it a night, but I got a few more things to say, all right? So the book of Jonah. So open up Jonah 1 verse 1, and in the King James Version, it will say, and it came to pass, right? And it came to pass. Normally, more modern versions of the Bible don't use that phrase. Your version probably simply says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh. All right? But that it came to pass is actually imperative that we understand that. In Hebrew, it sounds like this, vayahi, vayahi. So when you have this word in Hebrew, vayahi, it normally means that the story is already in progress. In other words, the book of Jonah doesn't begin where it begins. It's in progress. All right? So then you say, well, if it doesn't begin in 1 verse 1, where does it begin? Simple answer to that, at least in the books before Jonah, Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath-Hepher, is only mentioned one other time. 2 Kings 14:25. All right? So take a look at 2 Kings 14:25. That's where the story of Jonah begins. If we miss that, we miss the whole story. Because you got to know where the story begins. Of course, you got to know when the story ends. All right? So this is where it begins. This is this literary term, vayahi. It came to pass. We're not talking about kidney stones now, okay? It came to pass in Hebrew normally signals that the story is starting somewhere else. In this case, it starts in 2 Kings 14:25, which tells us that Jonah, all right, served under a northern Israelite king called Jeroboam ben Joash. And you can see in 2 Kings 14:25 that Jonah was like the Secretary of State telling the king of Israel, northern Israel, Jeroboam ben Joash, that he needs to extend the border, right, from Lebo Hamath all the way north, all right? All of which is to say, if you're the Secretary of State, if you're in the inner circle of the king of Israel during the northern kingdom's silver age, Solomon was the golden age of Israel. The 8th century is the silver age of Israel. All right, the stock market is up. Investments are going through the roof. And Jonah has a seat at the table. Jonah's got a very comfortable life, doesn't he? Financially, he's set, right? Vocationally, he's set, right? He's got great influence. He had a great ministry until God showed up. And God shows up in Jonah 1 verse 1. All right? Everybody got that? That's where it begins. The book of Jonah is a call out of our comfort zones. Oh, no. Oh, no. So, we know that Jonah is called to go to Nineveh. Nineveh. You can see this kind of artwork in Minneapolis, right? At the Minneapolis Institute of Art. They have 8th century BC Assyrian art. I actually took this picture in St. Petersburg, Russia. at the Hermitage, a world-class museum. Has about 3 rooms this size of 8th century Assyrian artwork. How many people were mesmerized by that? 1, me. All right. A lot of the artwork shows these Assyrians as animals. All right? Animals. In recorded history, there's been no civilization, no empire, no movement as bloody, as horrific as the 8th century BC Assyrians. Right? So Jonah, see, he has this great job, right, in the court of Jeroboam ben Joash, and now he's called to go where? To Nineveh, which will soon be the capital of these people. So what does Jonah do? He does what you and I would do, right? Look at verse 3. Jonah 1:3. He arose and fled to Tarshish. Now this is unprecedented in the Old Testament. This is the first time someone ignores God. All right? People complain a lot, all right? People make excuses a lot. Remember, Moses says he wasn't an fluent speaker. Jeremiah says, I'm too young. Gideon says, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh. I'm the least in my family. Jeremiah not only says he's too young, but he can't speak either. Isaiah says, I'm a man of unclean lips. I live in the midst of people of unclean lips. But Jonah says what? Nothing. It's like he's got a hotel room, and what does he put on the outside of the door? Do not disturb. All right? So no one's ever done this before. Jonah says nothing. He arises, all right, and he's going to go to Tarshish. That's probably modern day Tarsus, which would be actually in antiquity St. Paul's hometown in southeastern Turkey, just for the record, all right? But he's going to Tarshish, which is not to Nineveh. From the presence of the Lord, I want you to notice that he goes down to Joppa. He finds a boat there, going to Tarshish, and he buys the boat and hires out the sailors. Now it says he pays a wage. They didn't have tickets like the Titanic that Jack won, right? So we could meet Rose. They didn't have tickets for seagoing maritime travel until Roman times. This is 8th century BC. So not only the culture, but also the Hebrew tells us that he bought the ship, all right, and he hired out the sailors. Well, where did he get that kind of money? You know, 2 Kings 14:25. Jonah doesn't begin where it begins. And folks, it doesn't end where it ends. But we're not getting there too fast, all right? So he buys the ship and he goes down again. I want you to notice the repetition of going down 2 times in verse 3, all right? And then what does he do? He goes down again. I'm going down to verse 5. He goes down again. And he goes to the innermost parts of the ship. This is the end of 1 verse 5. And he lays down. So what does that tell you? That tells you that when you and I run from the mission of God, the only way to go is what? Down. Down. Down, doobie-doo, down, down. But I won't sing that song for us. Aren't you glad? All right. In chapter 2, verse 6, he goes down to the uttermost parts of the earth. All right? So down, 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 down. There are 5 down words connected to Jonah. And then, of course, back in 1 verse 5, he falls into a deep sleep. A deep sleep. It's the same word used of Adam in Genesis chapter 2 when God opens up his side and takes out a rib and the dude kept snoring. Right? Women, you know. Right? Yeah. So if Adam didn't wake up when God opened up his side and took out a rib, he was in a deep sleep. Right? And that's the same word used of Jonah. He's in a deep sleep. The sailors, though, right, led by the captain of the ship, they are what? They're very concerned. They're having their 19th nervous breakdown with Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones are still going great at like 90 years old. Who would have ever thought that? Which is an important point, not Mick Jagger, but of the book of Jonah. The outsiders get it. The insider doesn't. See, the outsiders, right, the sailors, they're freaking out. Jonah is what? He's taken 3 bottles of Excedrin PM. He's checked out. He doesn't care. The outsiders, these pagans, each man is crying out to his own God. You can see that in 1 verse 5. They actually care. In fact, when Jonah says, right, when Jonah wins the lottery, they roll the dice to figure out, hey, how come things have turned so bad so quickly, and the lot falls to Jonah. Jonah says, well, go ahead and throw me overboard. And they say, no. They want to what? Look at verse 13. The men row back to go to dry land. Well, you know this as well as I do, that if you're in a storm, the last thing you do is what? Try and go to shore, right? That's more shallow water. That'll certainly crash your boat. So the pagan sailors are willing to risk their lives for Jonah, and Jonah is the guy who's fallen asleep and says, throw me overboard. So they finally throw him overboard, and the storm calms down, and look what happens. Look what happens. Verse 16. The men feared a great fear, and they worshiped Yahweh. They sacrificed sacrifices to Yahweh, and they fulfilled their vows. So they went from each man crying out to his own God in 1:5 to their worshiping Yahweh, the God who made the heaven and the sea and the dry land. That's what Jonah says in 1:9. So go back to 1:9. First time Jonah speaks. And Jonah, see, so here's the good news. Jonah never gets it right. Neither do you and I. But God writes straight with crooked lines. Jonah says, look at his confession, right? It's kind of half-hearted. It's going to be like his half-hearted sermon in chapter 3. He says what in 1 verse 9? He says, I am a Hebrew. I worship Yahweh, the God of the heavens, and I fear him who made the sea and the dry land. And God used that to convert the sailors. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? That's what Vu Lee was telling us in the introduction, right? He was quoting from 1 Corinthians 3, verse 7. Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, God made it grow. It's not you or me. It's our sometimes feeble witness, our stuttering testimony that God uses to bring people to faith. All right? Well, they still throw him overboard. All right? They throw him overboard, and he gets swallowed by a fish. And Jonah's in that fish 3 days and 3 nights. That's chapter 2. All right? Chapter 2. And Jonah prays. In fact, if we would analyze this prayer in chapter 2, he quotes from or alludes to 25 different statements in the book of Psalms. Isn't that amazing? Where did Jonah get his prayer? Because I don't know about you, but if you're in the belly of a great big fish, you don't have the Lutheran service book. I don't know, right? He memorized sections of the book of Psalms. How else could he create and craft this beautiful prayer in chapter 2 with 25 connections to the book of Psalms? So Jonah's a believer, all right? He's a delinquent believer. He's a believer on the run. He's a believer who would much rather be comfortable than challenged, but he's still a believer. And chapter 2 is Jonah's strongest place and chapter and point. And what does that teach us? It teaches us what Paul teaches us in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. When we're weak, we're strong. When we're desperate, we pray. When we're on our knees, we finally have our heads on straight. So here's Jonah praying this beautiful prayer in his greatest need, that he has spent significant time in the book of Psalms, right? You know stories like this. I do too. I'm a part-time pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church in Eagan. And part of my responsibilities is go to a retirement center twice a month. And beautiful people there. And I've been to a lot of nursing homes, retirement centers as a pastor over the years. And a lot of times, you meet people, they don't remember much. But they remember the Lord's Prayer. They remember the 23rd Psalm. They remember, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, right? A mighty fortress is our God. Sometimes they remember the words of institution to the Lord's Supper. Occasionally they'll remember the Nicene Creed. They remember the Ten Commandments. This one man, his name is Chris Brandt, he'd always call me Pastor Blessing. I'd say, Blessing, But, he was kind of serious. No, your name is Pastor. Well, okay, we'll run with it. But he didn't really know who I was. But he knew all of those parts. So when do you prepare to get swallowed by a great big fish? Now. Right? Now. Right? What you're doing tonight. Right? What you do in worship. Okay, well, we know the story, right? It's as though 3 days and 3 nights of undigested Jonah was enough. So, woo, he gets bungeed out, right? And he lands on dry land. And then, right, yes, God, I can hear you now, right? One of the greatest verses in the Bible is Jonah 3, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, what? A second time. Isn't that amazing? Amazing. All right. Now remember, the story doesn't begin where it begins. It doesn't end where it ends. All right. So just keep that in mind. And then Jonah preaches this sermon, right? And it's a lot like his confession in chapter 1, right? In Hebrew, it's a 5-word sermon in chapter 3, verse 4. 5 words. 40 days in Nineveh will be changed. 40 days. You say, well, I'm a Lutheran. Where's the law and the gospel? It's all entailed in the word 40. 40, whether it's 40 days or 40 years, throughout the Bible, indicates a new beginning, right? With Noah and the flood, Israel in the wilderness, Elijah, remember Elijah in 1 Kings 19? We looked at that about a month ago. He took 40 days and 40 nights to get to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. He shows himself alive during the joyful Easter tide for 40 days. And at each of the end of those 40, there's a new beginning. And this is a God of new beginnings. Right? So there's the gospel. What's the law? You don't have 41 days. Right? God is slow to anger. Slow to anger. Right? When at one point in my life, all three of my children were teenagers, right? And I would never tell them, you have 40 days to clean your room, all right? Just wouldn't do that, all right? You have 40 days to do your homework. You have 40 days to mow the lawn. No, you do it when? Now. So look at how God's patience and kindness, 40 days, but you don't have 41 days, right? So the Ninevites believed, just like the sailors did in chapter 1. They believed, and they called a fast, and they even had animals fasting, right? And so then Jonah is finally ticked off about it. Now, what? So here's this great conversion of the Ninevites, all right? And Jonah, in chapter 4, he's under his ivy gourd plant. He would rather die than watch this happen. Oh, no. What's the deal? See, Jonah chapters 1 through 3 would be fine, right? All's well that ends well, right? They lived happily ever after. But if you go to chapter 4, verse 1, and I'm going to read the kind of the literal Hebrew here. It says, it was evil to Jonah, a great evil, and it angered him. So evil is a word that happens 10 times in the book, all right? Nineveh has evil. That's kind of what starts things in Jonah 1, verse 2. But the only time evil is modified by the adjective great, which it is in chapter 4, verse 1, is with Jonah. So Jonah has the greatest evil in the book. More evil than those bloody, horrific Assyrians. More evil than these idolatrous sailors. More evil than even the cats and dogs and horses and cattle in Nineveh. What's the greatest evil in the book of Jonah? Now get ready, here it comes. An unforgiving spirit. Oh no. Oh no. Now that's me. It really is. I can harbor hurt and nurse revenge just like you can. So that's why Jonah would rather die than see his enemy Ninevites receive the grace of God. As I said earlier, in the book of Jonah, the insider is oblivious and the outsiders get it. What does that tell us? There are all kinds of Jonah-like figures in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, aren't there? Here would be one. This is a famous Rembrandt painting, which, by the way, is at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia, but that's another story. But look at how Rembrandt has captured the older brother, looking down in disdain. How dare you, Dad? You know, forgive and have compassion and receive this son of yours who's a slave. One shoe off and one shoe on, right? There are all kinds of Jonah figures in the Gospels. And Jesus tells this parable, right, in Luke chapter 15, to who? Pharisees, right? So who were the consummate insiders? Pharisees, right? They knew their scripture, they knew their traditions, they knew their Bible, they knew their Hebrew, but they ended up missing everything, right? So let me put it this way. It's very dangerous to be on the inside. And guess what, folks? We're all on the inside. I mean, Pastor Wheeler and I, we're probably, we're more inside than anybody. Because what happens? We become like Jonah. Our hearts shrivel up. We become judgmental to people who are different from us. We become the judge, the jury, the prosecuting attorney, and the jailer. It's great to be on the inside. Don't get me wrong, right? Great to be on the inside. Know the scriptures, know the hymns, know the doctrine. We wouldn't trade this for anything. But the book of Jonah is in the prophetic section of the Old Testament. Have you noticed that? Well, why? It's like Ruth or Esther. It doesn't belong in the prophets. Oh, yes, it does. Because the prophetic message is, it's good to be on the inside, but it's also very dangerous because we take things for granted, don't we? Wilson, what is Wilson doing here? Anybody remember the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks? Yeah. Just raise your hand if you know the movie. Okay. All right. Well, good. Most of you do. But so Tom Hanks works for Federal Express, remember? He gets stranded on this desert island. He becomes good friends with volleyball. Right? A Wilson volleyball, so he calls him Wilson. So at the end of the story, finally, he gets off the island and he goes back to Memphis, Tennessee, and he was really in love with a woman before, this whole ordeal happened. And what did that woman do? She got married and had kids. So all he has left is this Federal Express package, right? That he's been holding on. He said, come hell or high water, I am going to deliver this package. And it's addressed to a ranch in Texas. So he gets on a plane and rents an SUV and goes out to this ranch in Texas, knocks on the door, no one's home. So he gets back in his SUV, he pulls up to a stop sign. And sure enough, a pickup truck, right, a Texas pickup truck pulls right up next to him, and it has the insignia on its back windshield, not windshield, but just back window, and the same insignia on the Federal Express package. And so he puts two and two together, and he says, who's ever in that pickup truck is the sole owner of this package. And who's in that pickup truck? A hunka burning Texas love. And then what happens? The movie ends. Did you remember that? I went to the popcorn stand and demanded my $360 back that I put down for Milk Duds, Coke, and popcorn. All right. So what, do anybody remember that? You say, well, what? And it's called, all right, here's the literary term, the rhetoric of entrapment. In authors, movies, and plays, etc., from time immemorial have done this, is they stop the action because they don't want to tell you what happened. They want you to become part of the story. See, if you see what happens, with Tom Hanks, then that's that. But if you don't see what happened, then you're at least encouraged to ask what question. Well, what would I do? Okay. Or, females, if there's like a hunka, burning Texas male love, okay? What would you do? So the story is not only about, right, the Federal Express guy. The story is also kind of about who? You. How does Jonah end? It ends with a question. In 4:11. God has Jonah under the unpredictable plant, right? Should I have compassion upon Nineveh, the great city? There is in it a multitude, right? 120,000 who don't know their right hand from their left, and many animals besides. This is one of only 2 books in the Bible that end with a question. So what is the author of the book doing? He's saying, I'm not telling you how Jonah answered, because the story's about Jonah. It's also about who? You. and me. So this book of Jonah doesn't begin where it begins, 2 Kings 14:25. The book of Jonah doesn't end where it ends, because the author is saying, you know what? You've got Ninevites, I've got Ninevites, all God's children got Ninevites. What are you going to do? Are you going to have compassion, forgiveness, go to Nineveh, or kind of stay put? But that's not where the story completely ends. This is amazing. The only prophet Jesus ever directly compares himself to is who? Jonah. Jonah. Matthew chapter 12, verse 41. Jesus says, one greater than Jonah is here. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? So the question, should God have compassion upon the Ninevites and the Edomites and the Moabites and the Amalekites and the people from Ethiopia and South America and Laos and Vietnam and Minnesota? Should God have compassion upon all these people? We don't know what Jonah said. We just don't. Rhetoric of entrapment. Our answer sometimes yes, sometimes no. We're not so sure. How did Jesus answer that question? Yes, yes. 1,000 times yes to compassion. And he wrote the answer in his blood. And because of that, Jesus says, I got your baggage. Now follow me. And he just might take us to Nineveh. Well, there you go. Go ahead and chew on that a little bit, and we'll come back after your small group time and see what questions you have. So, you're dismissed.